I remember the day we found the cabin so clearly it still sends chills through me. We weren't even supposed to be that deep into the woods. It was a family trip, one of those disconnect from the world weekends my wife had planned for months. She thought it would be good for the kids, 2 boys, ages 9 and 12, to get away from screens, from the city, from their usual routines. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I went along. She had booked a little rental house near the edge of a national forest, and the plan was to spend 3 days hiking, cooking over a fire, and enjoying nature. We arrived late Friday afternoon, unpacked, and settled in. The house was small but nice, perched near the start of a long, twisting trail that wound into the forest. The air was fresh, the trees tall, the sky open and blue. It was peaceful in a way the city never was. The first day was uneventful. We cooked, played cards, took a short walk. The kids were restless without their usual distractions, but they warmed up to the idea when we told them we'd go exploring the next day. Saturday morning, we packed snacks, filled water bottles, and set off down the trail. It was early spring, and the forest was alive with soft sounds. Birds calling, branches rustling, the occasional crack of a squirrel darting through dry leaves. We walked for a couple of hours, stopping now and then to rest, admire the trees, or check out interesting rocks and old stumps. At some point, we left the marked trail. I can't even say when it happened. The path had forked several times, and we hadn't been paying much attention, just letting the kids run ahead, following their laughter. Before long, we were surrounded by thicker woods, the trail narrowing, the trees pressing closer. That's when we found it. It was my oldest son who spotted the roofline first, a sagging structure half hidden by trees and brush, sitting crooked on a rise of ground. We pushed through the undergrowth, curious, and came upon an old cabin. It looked abandoned. The wood was weathered and gray, the porch slanted, one window cracked. The door hung slightly open on rusted hinges. Vines had crept up the walls, and leaves were piled thick around the base. We stood there for a while, just staring. It felt like a discovery, like we'd stumbled on something forgotten. My wife hesitated, saying maybe we should leave it alone, but the kids were too excited. They wanted to explore. I wanted to explore, so we carefully made our way up the steps, pushing the door open all the way. Inside, it was dusty and dim. The light from the windows slanted through the murky air, catching on floating specks. The floorboards creaked under our feet. The cabin had one main room with a battered table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace. A tiny kitchen space sat off to the side. In one corner, there was a narrow cot with a thin, worn blanket. At first glance, everything looked old. Dust covered the surfaces, cobwebs draped the corners, and the air smelled stale. We poked around carefully, pointing out old objects: a rusty lantern, cracked plates, a bundle of dried herbs hanging from a hook. Then I noticed the journal. It was sitting on the table, a small leather-bound notebook, the cover worn soft at the edges. I picked it up, curious, and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting, notes about the weather, the forest, the cabin itself. Someone had been documenting their time here. I assumed it was decades old until I reached the last entry. It was dated 3 days ago. I froze, heart hammering. 3 days ago? I looked around more closely. That's when I noticed the dust wasn't as thick in some spots. The table had been wiped clean in one area, the blanket on the cot was rumpled, and in the kitchen, a small pot still sat on the stove, as if left there after a recent meal. There was even a half-empty water bottle tucked under the cot, the plastic crinkled but clean. Someone had been here, recently, and maybe they still were. My skin crawled as I realized how wrong we had been to just wander in. I quietly gathered the kids, telling them it was time to go. My wife picked up on my sudden shift and helped usher them out. We stepped carefully off the porch, back into the woods. As we moved away, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Maybe they had been out gathering firewood, or checking traps, or even hiding nearby, waiting for us to leave. Maybe they were watching the cabin right now, seeing strangers poke through their things. We walked faster, pushing back through the underbrush, trying to retrace our steps. The woods seemed darker now, the trees thicker. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig made me jump. After what felt like hours, we finally found the main trail again. My shoulders relaxed slightly, but I didn't let us slow down until we were back at the rental house. The door locked behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the cabin, who had been living there, why they had left, if they had come back and found signs of us inside. I kept imagining them standing in the trees, watching, waiting. The next morning, we packed up early and left, cutting our trip short. My wife didn't argue. The kids, sensing the tension, stayed quiet. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Over the next few days, I kept wondering if I should have reported it, told the park service or the local authorities or someone. But what would I have said? That we'd found a cabin and a journal? That someone had been there recently? It wasn't illegal to camp or squat on public land. Maybe it was just a drifter, someone who wanted to be left alone. Still, it haunted me. Months later, I sometimes find myself waking in the middle of the night, heart racing, thinking I hear something outside. A soft step, a rustle, a knock. I lie there, staring at the ceiling, remembering the way that cabin felt, the stale air, the quiet, the sense of being somewhere you weren't supposed to be. And every time, I remind myself how lucky we were. We didn't wait around to see who came back. We didn't meet the person who had been living there. We walked away, and that's why we're still here. I never thought renting a cabin would lead to the most disturbing experience of my life. My name is Mark, and last October, my girlfriend Lisa and I decided to take a break from our busy lives. We both worked long hours at stressful jobs in the city, and the thought of getting away to a remote, quiet place sounded perfect. Lisa found a listing online, an old wooden cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It looked charming in the photos, with a small stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and big windows that let in the morning light. The owner said it had been in his family for years, mostly used in the summers, but it was available for rent in the fall. We packed up our car, brought plenty of food, drinks, some board games, and a few books, and made the long drive out. I remember how peaceful the drive was. Trees on either side, leaves turning shades of red and orange, and no signs of other cars once we got off the main highway. Felt like we were leaving the world behind. When we first arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. A bit weathered, sure, but charming. It sat back from a narrow dirt road, surrounded by tall trees. There was a small porch out front, an old rocking chair, and firewood stacked neatly beside the door. Inside, the place smelled like old pine and smoke. There was a bedroom with a big wooden bed, a small kitchen, and a living area with the fireplace and a worn-out couch. The first day and night went by peacefully. We unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the fire with some wine. That night, though, I noticed some creaks and soft thuds coming from different corners of the cabin. I shrugged it off. The place was old, after all. Old with shifts and groans. Lisa noticed it too, but we both laughed and said it was just part of staying in a rustic place. By the second night, the sounds seemed louder. It wasn't just the soft groaning of old beams, but sometimes sharper sounds, like small things falling or being moved. Once, I thought I heard a faint scraping sound coming from beneath the floor, but again, I convinced myself it was the house settling, or maybe an animal under the cabin. After all, we were in the woods. Raccoons, mice, or even stray cats could easily be moving around outside or under the place. We didn't think much of it until the third morning. Lisa went to the kitchen to make breakfast and called me over. "Did you eat the rest of the bread?" she asked. I hadn't. We both clearly remembered we had half a loaf left the night before, but it was gone. I thought maybe we'd eaten more than we realized, or maybe we'd thrown it out without thinking. Small things like that happen when you're distracted, I told her. That day, we went for a long hike around the area. There were no marked trails, but we followed the slope behind the cabin down to a stream, walked alongside it for a while, then circled back up. We didn't see a single other person the whole time. By the time we got back, the sun was already sinking, and we were tired and hungry. That evening, we made pasta and opened another bottle of wine. Lisa pulled out a board game, and we played by the fire. The creaks were back again, sometimes making the floor feel like it trembled just slightly underfoot. At one point, I paused and pressed my ear to the floorboards, half joking. I thought I heard something, maybe the faintest shuffling sound, but it was so light I couldn't be sure. We went to bed a little unsettled, but still not truly worried. The next morning, more food was missing. 2 apples, a pack of crackers, and one of the bottled drinks we'd brought. This time, we knew for sure we hadn't eaten or moved them. Lisa began to look nervous. "Maybe an animal got in somehow?" she said. Though we checked the doors and windows, which were all locked. We even checked the little attic space, just to be sure there weren't squirrels or something hiding up there. That night, we hardly slept. The creaking noises were constant, and at one point, I woke up with the clear feeling that someone had moved through the cabin. I even got up and checked the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom. Nothing. Lisa was wide awake too, staring at the dark ceiling. We agreed we'd probably cut the trip short if things didn't settle down. The next morning, Lisa found what looked like a smudge on the kitchen floor, near the cabinet. It looked like a dirty handprint. It was faint, but once I saw it, my stomach tightened. We hadn't noticed anything like that before. I looked around the cabin again, this time checking under the sink, behind the curtains, under the couch. Still nothing. Finally, I went outside and walked around the perimeter. That's when I noticed the small wooden door near the base of the cabin. A crawl space door. It was partly hidden by weeds and old boards. I bent down and pulled on it. Creaked open easily. A rush of cool, damp air hit me, carrying the smell of earth and old wood. I shined my flashlight inside. What I saw made my skin crawl. There was a pile of crumpled blankets, fast food wrappers, empty water bottles, and even some of our missing food, the apple cores, the cracker box. Someone had been living down there. For a long moment, I just crouched there, heart hammering. The crawl space was only about 3 feet tall, but it ran under the whole cabin. I backed away slowly, my breath catching. Lisa came outside, asking what was wrong, and I held up my hand to stop her from coming closer. We packed our bags in silence. Neither of us spoke, but we both moved quickly, stuffing clothes, toiletries, and whatever was left of the food into our bags. I didn't even care about the board games or books we'd brought. I kept glancing at the crawl space door, terrified that whoever had been living under there might crawl out at any moment. We got into the car and drove. I remember how tense we were, constantly looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to come running out of the trees. We didn't even stop to contact the cabin owner until we were several miles away, back in an area with cell service. I called him and told him everything, the noises, the missing food, the crawl space. He was shocked. He said no one was supposed to be up there. I don't know who was living under the cabin. Maybe it was a squatter, someone who knew the place was empty most of the year. Maybe it was someone passing through, looking for a place to stay warm and dry. But what haunts me is that we'd been there for days, sleeping just feet above them, never knowing. Looking back, all the sounds we thought were just the house settling, all the missing food we thought we'd misplaced. It was all signs we missed. We stayed in that cabin while a stranger crept out at night to steal from our kitchen, then slipped back under the floor before morning. When I think about it now, I wonder if they watched us through the floorboards or from cracks in the walls. I wonder if they were there before we arrived or if they moved in after we got there. But mostly, I wonder what might have happened if we'd stayed one more night. After we got home, Lisa and I both agreed we wouldn't rent remote cabins again, at least not ones we hadn't checked out in person first. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up at night, sure I hear faint creaking sounds under the floor. It's hard to feel safe when you've lived through something like that. You learn, in a deep and unsettling way, that sometimes the scariest things are not the old wood or the wild animals, but the people hiding just out of sight. We were lucky. We left before anything worse happened. But I will never forget the feeling of crouching by that crawl space door, shining my flashlight into the dark, and realizing the truth. Realizing that someone had been right there under our feet the whole time. I can still remember that weekend clear as day, though I've spent months trying to forget it. It was supposed to be a break, a quiet cabin retreat in the woods with friends. Nothing special, nothing fancy, just 3 days away from work, city noise, and constant phone notifications. That's all we wanted. We had no idea how close we came to something far darker. There were 5 of us, me, my friend Sam, his girlfriend Emma, our friend Josh, and Josh's younger brother Ryan. We were all in our 20s except Ryan, who had just turned 19 and was tagging along for the weekend. Sam had found the cabin listing online. It was an old wooden cabin on the edge of a lake, deep in the forest, about an hour past the last small town. It advertised itself as off the grid. No internet, no cell reception, no neighbors, no distractions. Just trees, water, and peace. We drove up Friday morning, crammed into 2 cars, loaded with snacks, drinks, gear, and a cooler full of food. The drive was long, the last stretch taking us over narrow dirt roads full of potholes, lined with thick trees. We passed no other houses, no people, no signs of life. Just trees pressing in on both sides, the road twisting so tightly we kept checking the GPS to make sure we hadn't missed a turn. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures Sam had shown us. Small, made of old weathered wood, with a sagging roof and a crooked porch. It had 2 tiny bedrooms, a small kitchen with a battered old stove, a fireplace in the main room, and a porch out back facing the lake. There was a stone fire pit out front and an old picnic table that had seen better days. The lake behind the cabin was still and glassy, surrounded by tall pines. You could hear the wind moving through the branches, the occasional rustle of leaves, and nothing else. I remember feeling a little uneasy as we unloaded the cars, though I told myself it was just the isolation. We were so far from anyone. If something went wrong, there was no easy help. But I kept that to myself. The others were excited, already talking about campfires and swimming and drinking by the lake. We spent the first afternoon getting settled. We put our bags in the bedrooms, stacked the food in the tiny fridge, and set up sleeping bags and blankets in the main room for extra space. We explored the shore a little, skipped rocks, and gathered wood for the fire pit. That evening, we cooked dinner over the flames, drank, and sat under the stars, talking and laughing. That night was the first time I noticed how quiet it got out there. Once the fire burned down and we moved inside, the silence wrapped around the cabin like a heavy blanket. No cars, no distant voices, no hum of anything mechanical. Just the creak of old boards, the whisper of wind against the walls, and the occasional snap of a twig outside. I lay awake for a long time, listening to every sound, telling myself it was just an old building settling, just animals moving through the woods. The next morning, we cooked breakfast on the stove and spent the day exploring. We hiked along the edge of the lake, wandered through the woods, and took turns paddling an old rowboat we'd found tied up by the shore. By evening, we were tired but happy. We built another fire, roasted marshmallows, and stayed up late, drinking and watching the stars blink through the gaps in the trees. It was after midnight when we first heard it. We were just starting to gather up the empty bottles and get ready to head inside when a sound floated out from the trees. Faint at first, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, but then we all froze, listening. It was a voice, a woman's voice, screaming, not just yelling or calling out, screaming for help. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the reach of our firelight. High-pitched, panicked, desperate. Help! Followed by a sob, then another help! Again, the sound twisting through the trees. My skin crawled. We stood there for a few moments, frozen. The voice kept coming, weak and strained, echoing between the trees. Instinctively, Sam grabbed a flashlight. Josh was already moving toward the treeline. Ryan hesitated, looking back and forth between them and me. Against every warning bell going off in my head, I followed. We stepped past the fire pit into the dark wall of trees. Our flashlights sliced through the blackness, bouncing off trunks and undergrowth. The air was cold and still. The screaming continued, broken, gasping, pulling us deeper. But as we moved, something felt off. The voice never seemed to get closer. No matter how far we walked, it stayed just ahead, always just out of reach. And it was too regular. The same cries, the same pattern over and over, like a recording looped again and again. I stopped, heart pounding. I turned, shining my light behind me. The cabin was gone from view. I couldn't even see the faint glow of the fire pit. A wave of panic hit me. I called out softly to Sam and Josh, motioning to turn back. Without another word, we pivoted and hurried back through the trees, pushing past branches, stumbling over roots, hearts racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us through the dark. When we finally broke through the tree line and into the clearing, I almost collapsed from relief. The cabin stood ahead, dimly lit from inside, and the last embers of the fire pit glowed faintly. Emma and Ryan were waiting on the porch, pale and wide-eyed. We didn't go back out that night. None of us slept well. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, flinching at every creak and groan of the old wood. Once or twice, I thought I heard something moving outside. Faint footsteps, the snap of a twig, maybe even a soft voice drifting through the trees. But I shut my eyes tight and forced myself to stay put. The next morning, we packed early. We were supposed to stay one more night, but nobody wanted to. Without even discussing it, we quietly gathered our things, loaded the cars, and left the cabin behind. On the way out, we stopped for gas in the nearest town, a small, worn-down place with one main street. While the others filled up the tanks, I went inside the gas station, feeling uneasy and wanting to say something. I approached the counter and asked the older man working there if he'd ever heard strange things out by the lake cabins. He gave me a long, hard look. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah," he said simply. "We hear things sometimes, but we know better than to go looking." He told me, in a quiet, steady voice, that there had been reports over the years. People hearing screams in the woods or cries for help, or sometimes even the sound of children crying. But it wasn't what it seemed. He said there were people out there, criminals, thieves, sometimes worse. They used fake screams, fake calls, to lure campers and cabin renters out of their shelters and into the dark. Once you were deep enough into the woods, they'd jump you, rob you, sometimes beat you, sometimes worse. Locals knew to stay inside, no matter what they heard. My stomach twisted. We had walked right into it, followed the sound without thinking, drawn by the idea that someone needed help. If we'd gone a little farther or stayed out a little longer, we might not have made it back. I didn't tell the others everything I'd heard. I just wanted to get home. Since that trip, I haven't gone back to the woods. I don't camp. I don't hike. I don't rent remote cabins, no matter how peaceful they seem. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I think about how easily we were fooled, how close we came to something we didn't understand. And every time, I remind myself, when you hear something strange in the woods, a voice, a cry, a call for help, you stay inside. You don't follow it. You don't investigate. You stay inside and you wait for morning. I've always enjoyed hiking solo. Some people find it lonely, but for me, it's peaceful. No one talks. No one hurries you along. No one slows you down. It's just you, your steps, the woods, the wind. Over the years, I've learned to handle myself well outdoors. I bring proper gear, I know how to navigate, I plan carefully. I like to think I'm careful, not reckless. Last fall, I decided to take a short trip into a remote stretch of forest I hadn't visited before. I'd heard about an old backcountry cabin that was available for overnight hikers. It wasn't maintained much, no services, no guarantees, but it was there, and I figured it would save me the trouble of setting up camp. The plan was simple. Hike in on day one, stay overnight at the cabin, hike out the next morning. A nice little loop, 2 days of walking, some peace and quiet. I set off early in the morning, the trees towering overhead, the trail narrow and a little overgrown. The forest was beautiful. Autumn colors just starting to creep across the leaves, the light shifting through the branches, the air crisp and cool. I saw no one all day, which didn't surprise me. This area wasn't popular. It was too remote, too rugged. That was part of why I liked it. By late afternoon, I reached the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, a squat wooden structure with a slanted roof and weathered walls. It looked old but solid. I walked around it first, inspecting it. The windows were small and grimy, the door heavy and stiff. There were no signs of recent use, no footprints, no tire tracks, no trash. It looked like no one had been there in months, maybe longer. Inside, the cabin was basic. A wooden bunk against one wall, an old wood stove in the corner, a small table, a single chair. Dust coated everything. There were a few shelves with rusted cans, but I had brought my own supplies. I set down my pack, stretched, and took a deep breath. The sun was already dipping low, shadows stretching long across the clearing. I spent a little time outside, making a simple dinner on my camp stove, watching the sky darken. The woods were quiet. No voices, no motors, just the occasional rustle of leaves or creak of a tree in the wind. It was peaceful and I was tired. Once I finished eating and cleaned up, I went inside, rolled out my sleeping bag on the bunk, and settled in. The air was cold, but I had a good bag, and soon I was wrapped up and half asleep, listening to the faint creaks of the old cabin. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to deal with the wood stove, and I was already warm enough. That night, I slept deeply. I remember waking once or twice to shift positions, but nothing unusual disturbed me. It was just me, the dark, the woods, the wind. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed something was wrong. I got up early, the light pale and gray outside the window. I stretched, packed up my gear, and stepped outside to make coffee before heading back down the trail. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were clear in the dirt and grass around the cabin. Heavy boot prints circling the building. At first, I didn't react. I just stood there, looking at them, still half asleep. But as I crouched down, looking closer, I realized they hadn't been there the day before. When I'd arrived, the ground had been undisturbed. I was sure of it. These footprints were fresh. I followed them slowly, my heart starting to beat faster. They came from the trees, circled the cabin several times, passed close to the door, then looped around the window. Whoever it was, they hadn't just walked by. They had come close, moving slowly, silently, right up against the walls where I had been sleeping inside. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't heard a thing. I'd been completely unaware while someone was just a few feet away, in the dark, moving around and around the cabin. I stood still, listening to the woods, but everything was silent. No movement, no voices, no crack of branches. I packed up quickly. I didn't eat breakfast. I just grabbed my pack, made sure I had everything, and started down the trail. My hands were shaking a little as I tightened the straps. The walk back felt different. The day before, I'd enjoyed the quiet, the solitude. Now every sound made me tense. Every snapping twig, every flicker of movement in the trees caught my eye. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the woods, looking for signs of someone following me. But I saw no one. I tried to tell myself it was harmless. Maybe another hiker, curious about the cabin. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone camping nearby. But none of that explained the silence, the slow, careful circling, the fact that they hadn't called out or knocked or shown themselves. Why had they been there? Why hadn't they let me know? I didn't stop to rest. I hiked hard all day, pushing myself to cover the miles and get back to the trailhead. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, sweat cooling on my skin despite the cold. I threw my pack into the back seat, climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while, my hands gripping the wheel. The drive home felt longer than usual. My mind kept replaying the footprints, the quiet loops around the cabin, the fact that I had slept through all of it. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong. If that person had wanted to break in, steal from me, hurt me, I wouldn't have known until it was too late. But they hadn't. They just watched or walked or whatever they were doing and then left. That part bothered me the most. Over the next few days, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was fine, nothing had happened. But at night, lying in bed, I kept seeing the cabin in my mind. The dark window, the quiet woods, the figure moving unseen just outside the walls. I kept thinking about how vulnerable I had been, alone out there, miles from anyone, with no cell signal, no way to call for help. I stopped hiking solo for a while. I stuck to busier trails, places where I knew there would be other people, where help wasn't far away. I didn't go back to that cabin or that stretch of forest. Sometimes, even now, I wonder who it was. A lost hiker? A hunter? Someone living rough in the woods? Or someone looking for an easy target, testing the door, circling quietly in the dark to see who was inside? I'll never know. But what I do know is that I was lucky. Lucky they didn't try the door. Lucky they didn't break a window. Lucky they just walked away. It's easy to feel safe in the woods, surrounded by nature, far from the noise of the world. But when you're truly alone, you realize just how thin the walls are, just how easily someone can slip close without you knowing. I think about that sometimes when I'm falling asleep, about the silent footprints, the careful steps just outside, and the fact that all night long, I never heard a thing. I remember the exact feeling in my chest when we first pulled up to the cabin. It was a tight, pressing sort of excitement, the kind you get when you finally escape from work, from your phone, from everything noisy and busy. We'd booked the place online a few weeks before, wanting something small, private, and tucked away deep in the woods. The pictures showed a rustic little cabin, dark wood on the outside, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs, surrounded by trees so thick you could barely see the sky. It was cheap too, maybe too cheap, but we were on a budget, and at the time it felt like a lucky find. We arrived late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees, sending long shadows over the dirt driveway. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe a little older, a little more worn, but that didn't bother me. We hauled our bags from the car, walked up the 3 creaky porch steps, and let ourselves in with the code the owner had emailed. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The front room was small but cozy. A couch, a stone fireplace, a small dining table by the window, and a tiny kitchenette along the back wall. There was a hallway off to the right leading to the bedroom and bathroom. The whole place was only about 500 square feet, but it was enough. We spent the first hour unpacking and settling in. I remember standing by the window, looking out at the trees, feeling peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the creaks of the cabin settling. Felt isolated, safe, like we were cut off from the world. That was the whole point. Later that evening, after we'd eaten and sat for a bit on the porch, we came back inside to light a fire. I was looking around the room, taking in the details, when something caught my eye. On the ceiling, above the couch, was a smoke detector. Nothing strange about that, of course, but it was one of those newer-looking white plastic models, very out of place in the otherwise rustic cabin. I remember frowning, feeling a small tug of suspicion, but I brushed it off. It was only later, when we were getting ready for bed, that the feeling came back. I was brushing my teeth, and I caught a glimpse of another smoke detector in the bedroom, positioned directly over the bed. Again, it looked newer, cleaner than everything else around it. I pointed it out casually, more joking than anything, but the thought stuck in my head. I lay awake a long time that night, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the ticking of the old clock in the living room, the occasional creak of wood. My eyes kept drifting up to the smoke detector. I knew it was probably nothing, but I also knew it was easy these days to hide small cameras. Tiny, barely visible lenses inside everyday objects. It was one thing to see a smoke detector above the kitchen or hallway, but directly above the bed, that felt off. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. After breakfast, I pulled a chair under the detector in the bedroom and climbed up to take a closer look. Up close, I could see something strange. A tiny dark circle, just off-center on the surface, almost like a pinhole. My stomach turned. I called my partner over and we both examined it closely. It wasn't like either of us were experts, but it didn't look like any normal smoke detector we'd seen. I decided to unscrew it carefully. Came off easily, and when I flipped it over, my heart dropped. Inside was a small, blinking light connected to a tiny circuit board and a small camera lens no larger than a fingernail. For a moment, we both just stood there, staring at it. My skin crawled with the realization. Someone had been watching, or at least someone had the ability to watch. I felt sick. We went through the rest of the cabin, checking every corner, every device. We found another camera in the living room smoke detector, and one more in the bathroom, disguised inside a small air freshener plugged into the wall. The more we looked, the worse it got. It felt like the walls were closing in, like every inch of privacy had been stolen. At first, I didn't know what to do. We sat at the dining table, both of us pale, hearts racing, trying to figure out our next move. I grabbed my phone and started searching online for the cabin's name, address, anything I could find. That's when the horror deepened. It didn't take long. A few searches brought up old news articles, forum posts, and even a couple of local news videos. The cabin, it turned out, had a reputation, one that wasn't mentioned in the rental listing. A year ago, the owner had been arrested for secretly recording guests using hidden cameras planted throughout the cabin. There had been a court case, but apparently the man had been released on bail, and the property was still being rented under a different name. I sat frozen, reading post after post from past guests, some dating back years. Stories about strange devices, cameras hidden in vents, in picture frames, in lamps. Complaints to the rental site, promises that the listing would be taken down. And yet here we were, sitting in the same cabin under the same hidden eyes. I felt a mix of anger, shame, and fear. I couldn't believe we'd been so careless. I couldn't believe this was still happening. We decided to leave immediately. We packed everything in a rush, stuffing clothes into bags, tossing toiletries into a duffel. My hands were shaking. I kept looking around, feeling like we were being watched even now. Maybe the cameras were live streaming. Maybe someone was out there, watching us frantically gather our things. When we finally got everything into the car, we paused just long enough to take pictures of the cameras and the devices, documenting everything. We didn't want to leave without proof. Then we got in, locked the doors, and drove. The dirt road out of the woods felt longer than it had on the way in. Every bend in the road made me nervous. Every shadow between the trees made my stomach clench. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car following us, someone coming after us. But there was nothing, just trees, the winding road, and the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. We drove straight to the nearest town, a good 40 minutes away, and went to the police station. Inside, we explained everything, showed them the photos, gave them the address. The officer we spoke to listened carefully, his face grim. He said they'd had reports about that property before, that they were already investigating the owner, but that it was a slow process. He took our statements, thanked us for the evidence, and promised they would follow up. I remember sitting there, feeling drained, a deep exhaustion settling in. I felt dirty, like my skin was crawling, like I wanted to scrub the whole weekend off me. We booked a hotel that night, too shaken to drive all the way home. Later, I filed a report with the rental site, attaching the photos and explaining everything that had happened. We heard back a few days later. They were removing the listing and launching their own investigation. I wanted to believe that would be the end of it, that the cabin would finally be shut down for good. But after what I'd read online, I wasn't sure. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it. Every time I walked into a hotel room or a rental, my eyes would go straight to the corners, the ceilings, the vents. Every beep of a smoke detector made me tense. I'd lie awake at night, imagining how long we might have been recorded, what might have been captured, where those recordings might end up. It was a violation so complete, so intimate, that it left a scar on my sense of safety. In the end, we never heard whether the owner was arrested again. We followed the case for a while, checked the news, but eventually, the updates stopped coming. Maybe the system caught up to him. Maybe it didn't. What I know is this: I'll never trust a rental again without doing deep research first. I'll never step into a strange room without scanning every corner, every device, every smoke detector. And I'll never forget the feeling of standing in that cabin, looking up at that tiny, hidden eye, and realizing that we were never alone.